The sewing machine hummed like a distant conversation, steady, patient, the same low voice that had kept me company through the night since Kofi left the house quiet. My fingers remembered the rhythm without me thinking. Slide the fabric, guide the foot, lift the presser, snip the thread. A single lamp burned over the table, its circle of light warm and small against the slow dark. Outside, a clock on the neighbor's porch marked each hour with a soft, indifferent bell. I bent over the silk and thought of hands that had taught me how to hold a needle, and of a red spool pinned to the inside of my apron like a small, stubborn heart. Before I begin the story, stay with me until the end. If this reaches you, please subscribe and like so others can hear how a life mended can become a place of work and welcome. If you want more stories like this, ring the bell to be notified when the next one comes. When Zuri was a child, she used to climb into my lap and count the stitches as if they were stars. She would whisper which color the dress should be, tracing the imagined hem with a finger that had once trusted everything I made. Later, there were times she walked away from those afternoons as if they had been someone else's. People grow into the world like garments that no longer fit, stretched at the seams or folded too small, and sometimes the ones we made for them become strange under their hands. The dress I was finishing now was meant for her wedding. I told myself that out loud as if saying it would make it true. Kofi had liked the ways I worked in the night. He said my hands turned trouble into order. He would come to the doorway and watch the machine's needle go up and down, and he would laugh softly and call it a hymn. When he died, the hymn did not stop. The needle kept going because I had to eat and because my fingers forgot how to be idle. But some nights, alone with the hum, my throat tightened and I would fold the fabric over my knees and feel around the place where sorrow sat, like a loose button that needed mending. The dress was simple in my mind, shell of pale chiffon, a bodice I thought of as armor, and lace that caught the light but did not shout. I had a red thread threaded through the lining, a piece of Kofi's old fishing line dyed and turned to silk by the women at the market, and I sewed it into the seam at the waist where only I could see it. It was a thing for me, a quiet claim that love had passed through my hands. I sewed small prayers into the hymns. Lord, steady the hand. Lord, keep her safe. They were not words I spoke out loud often, but in the push and pull of a shuttle they felt right. There were days when I believed that a dress could change a day. When Zuri first came to show me the engagement ring, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that can be both fierce and childlike, I let myself imagine a small, private joy. The way she would stand beneath a balcony of white flowers, the way her laugh might thin the air. She told me, with the hardness that sometimes settled over her voice, that the wedding would be held at the Grand Magnolia. She wanted something modern, imported, something that would feel like an entrance. I said nothing of the price of such things. I only nodded and set to work. People in our neighborhood watch one another like weather. They learn which households will shelter them through storms, which will bend and break, which will hold steady. Some watched me stitch and called me steady. Others saw me as the woman who would do the work for less because she had to. The difference is small and sharp. Dignity can look like stubbornness or like necessity, depending on who's naming it. Imani Ellington was a woman who kept the room like a finely pressed napkin. She had the banked assurance of someone who never had to ask for a favor, and the dangerous small ways of a person who liked to be admired. Years ago, at a luncheon I had barely been able to afford to attend, she had laughed, loud and bright, at the hem of my dress. It was a tiny thing, the way she pinched the fabric between her fingers and asked, "Oh, where did you get this?" Her laugh was a sharp stone in me. I wore that memory like a thorn until the day it broke free. When Zuri announced the wedding plans, Imani invited herself. Not invited, really. She moved into the margins as a patron does, folding her influence around the couple as if it were a coat. I have connections, she told Zuri, in a tone that made the word look like a favor and a debt at once. Zuri, who had always wanted more of the world than our small street offered, ate the favor for breakfast. Pride is hungry in some people. It swells where there is nothing else to feed it. The afternoon Zuri brought the dress home was a quiet, bright day. Sunlight fell across the wooden steps in golden planks. I had wrapped the fabric in brown paper the way my mother used to. The soft scrape reminded me of earlier hands. Zuri caught the package and turned it, then paused as if remembering something else was waiting in her pocket. She opened it with my name on the bow, and her face changed as quickly as a portrait in a shop window when the light shifts. There was no thank you that stayed. There were only the small, brittle sounds of someone rearranging their life. "You made this?" she asked. The word came with a softness that was not quite kind. There was a hesitation, like a breath held too long. "It's Grandma's kind of thing," she said, and I could hear the space the word made between us. She folded the chiffon and the lace with the care of someone who handled a relic, something to be seen but not touched. She left the package on the stoop and went into the house. I followed because I always followed. In the way a mother does, your feet remember the route to your child's door. In the kitchen, voices rose, Zuri and Imani talking about color palettes and lighting, and there, as sharp as a pin, I heard the word outdated. My chest went hollow with a familiar nausea. I could have turned back to my machine and let the small room of my life hold its quiet. Instead, I stepped into the doorway. They were laughing then, the kind of easy laughter shared between two people who pool each other's ideas until they look bigger than they are. Imani reached for the dress where Zuri had flung it on a chair. "This is sweet," she said, "but darling, if you wear something like that, if people see..." If people see. The sentence hung like a clothesline with nothing on it. Zuri's eyes flashed with something I could recognize only as shame, hot and sudden and humiliating. She smoothed the chiffon with a hand that trembled. "Maybe the designer will bring samples tonight," Imani said. "We'll see the real silk. We should be seen well." My hands went cold. I stood there and felt as if the humming of the machine had moved into my chest and stopped. I remember my mouth forming sound, a papery thing, and then nothing. I told myself to say nothing in case my voice turned into pleading. No good ever comes through pleading. I folded my hands as if in prayer and watched them plan my daughter's exclusion. Zuri picked up the package again and walked toward the back door. "I'll put this out with the trash," she said, an everyday way of erasing me. It was not spoken like a cruelty. It was tilted, practical, efficient, the vanity of someone who thinks only of surfaces. I felt the world shift. Later, at dusk, when the house had exhaled and the street had cooled, I went outside. The trash sacks smelled of yesterday's food and the small heat of the day. I crouched by the curb and found the package, crumpled and damped where the rain had come and gone. The silk inside was speckled with mud, the lace crushed at the edges like flowers trodden into a path. For a breath, I held my face close and felt as if I had been unmade and sewn again by a nameless hand. I could have left it there. I could have carried myself back inside and pretended I had never had a dress in trembling hands. Instead, I brought it home. I spread it over my table, took a deep breath, and unpinned each ruined pleat with my finger as if I could undo the shame with careful thought. The first days after that were a slow, furious inventing. I laid the silk on the machine and set the tension low and let the needle kiss the fabric lightly. I washed what could be washed, steamed what could be coaxed, and when the chiffon still had dark smudges, I covered them with a hand-embroidered vine of tiny white flowers, each stitch a small insistence. I ripped away the ruined pieces and replaced them with scraps I'd kept for such a need, the kind of saving a practical life teaches. Buttons, a strip of velvet, a lining from an old blouse that had been mine before Kofi and I learned to share pockets of money like prayers. In the seam at the waist where the red thread sat waiting, I left it visible this time, just a small knot at the underside, a secret knot that only a certain kind of heart could find. It was not for Zori to see necessarily. It was for the dress to remember the hands that had made it whole. Sometimes you mend for the future, not for the audience. There were afternoons when my fingers shook so badly that the stitch line would wobble like a voice off key. I would stop, breathe into the back of my ribs and whisper, "Lord, guide my hands." It was a short prayer. It was the same prayer mothers have said when there seemed no other language that fit the moment. Word of what Amani had done traveled the neighborhood like a rumor in a dry season. People gave their opinions in the corners of markets, and the apprentices from the barber shop brought me small gifts, spools of thread, coffee beans, a lemon tart wrapped in paper. They were shy with their kindness, as if they feared to impose. I took each spool and thanked them. In the small, practical gestures of others, there was a kind of grace that felt like sunlight after rain. Zori avoided my eyes for a while. When she did come around, she used the careful politeness of someone who keeps their hands in gloves so the touch is always safe. There were dinners where she sat across from me and told me about venue contracts and seating plans, and there were silences where everything she would have wanted to say lodged like a needle between her ribs. I watched her, and sometimes I wanted to break the polite armor she had put on and say the simplest things. I do not want to be excluded from your joy. I made this for you because I love you. But love sometimes cannot be bridled in words. It has to be shown in the way you will not abandon the work. One morning, a letter arrived that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and of the outside world. It was in Kofi's handwriting, slanted, sure, and I had not expected to find anything new from him. He had been careful with words when he was alive, as with the boat he kept, steady and patient. The letter was folded and tucked in a long-ago pattern behind a stack of patterns I had been meaning to use. It read like a conversation across years, small, practical counsel, and a few things that felt like confessions. "I leave you the red spool," he had written, "and the place where I saved pennies for the fools I loved. Do with it as you must. Find those girls who will take a needle rather than a retainer. Build them a place to work. If you ever feel small, remember this. You have always mended more than clothes." There was a scrap of bank acknowledgement folded inside, enough to begin the Hope Studio he had named in his dreams, enough to pay the first month's rent on a room with windows that look over the market. I sat with the paper trembling in my hands. It felt like the crest of a wave meeting my shore, a thing I had expected, but whose force still startled me. Kofi had never been showy. His love had the texture of bread, plain, steady. And now that steadiness had been given back as a quiet provision. I pressed the letter to my lips as if I could taste his patient blessing. When I thought of opening the Hope Studio, I saw a small room with tools lined like soldiers, a clock at the wall, a place where apprentices could learn to thread and to be proud without being ashamed. I saw Naya, Zuri's small child who still counted my stitches like stars, there in a chair learning to wind bobbins. The idea steadied me. But before any of that, there was the matter of the dress and the fact that Zuri had, with an ordinary tilt of voice, thrown it away. People have many ways of protecting themselves from what they fear. Zuri had let the world's opinion sit like a stone on her chest. She had been taught to believe that being polished was the only way to be accepted. I had to decide how to meet that. I could have let it pass and sewn and opened a studio quietly and welcomed apprentices without ever closing the hole between mother and daughter. Or I could do something else, something that would not be loud but would be visible in a room where many eyes might be watching. I began to restore the dress in earnest. I took the linings apart and washed them in warm water with lemon and a drop of blue soap that made the chiffon hiss like small rain. When the stains would not leave, I embroidered over them. When the lace gave out, I patched it with small flowers stitched in white thread, my old pattern, and made them bloom across the skirt. I reinforced seams and understitched hems until they sat like held hands. I worked until midnight sometimes, and when exhaustion pressed against my eyelids, the light over my table made a small halo, and I would think of Kofi leaning in the doorway and smiling his soft smile. One evening, as the repaired fabric lay across the table like a sleeping thing, I threaded my needle with that red thread and let it pass under the lining where no one would see it in the light of the day. I tied a knot and tucked the little tail inside. The red was a small joke at fate. It was a signature, a reminder that what is thrown away can be found, and that love has a stubbornness that does not show off. The next day, I put the dress on a mannequin of sorts, an old dress form that had once belonged to a tailor down the street, and looked at the silhouette in the mirror. It was like seeing a face you had loved in a crowd and recognizing the architecture of its features. I smoothed the skirt with my palm and whispered a short, private benediction. I did not know how Zuri would receive this if she ever saw it again. I only knew what I had to do. I had to make beauty where there had been a bruise. Word of a small restored gown is a strange thing. I did not intend to use it as a spectacle. I told only a few of the apprentices about it, those who came to learn the way a thread finds another thread. They sat on my stoop as I explained the stitches, how to reinforce a bias, where to place a dart so a body could breathe, how to finish a hem so it would wear like a patient friend. In their eyes, I saw something like hunger that was not shame. They saw craft as a way forward, not a thing to hide. Still, the wedding approached like a tide. Invitations had been printed on heavy card, and I had handled the fabric that would sit under Zuri's hands when she signed her name. There was a plan now, half-formed and dangerous with possibility. What if, instead of letting a stranger silk announce my daughter's name, I could make a scene small enough to be true and certain enough to be heard? What if I could take the thing she had thrown away and show it where people expected something else? I thought of the grand magnolia chandeliers and the way light fractures over a crowd when it finds lace. I thought of Imani, of her polished laugh, and of the small way people tilt toward the loudest offerings. The night before the wedding, I wrapped the dress again in brown paper and carried it under my arm. The city had its own late-hour music, the shout of a fruit vendor packing his cart, the high note of a radio somewhere, the distant leak of a fountain, and I walked slowly, as if my footsteps were a pattern to be followed. I came to the dumpster behind the venue, where the staff dropped old bows and ribbon, and I waited until a young porter rolled a cart past. I slipped the package into the cart as if I were doing some ordinary errand. I wanted to be both invisible and remembered. When I left, the feeling in my chest was not triumph nor spite, but a sharp, cool resolve, as steady as the machine's hum. I had no plan for spectacle, only the perfect smallness of a truth being set where it could be seen. I walked home with the night blowing into my face like a promise. I do not think I slept. When dawn made the edge of the curtains thin and blue, I went back to the house and put on the dress I had once thought of as armor. I pinned the sleeves with a careful tenderness I save only for things that have been through trouble. Zuri came down the stairs like someone rehearsing grief as if it were a new dress. She did not meet my eyes. In the living room, Imani arrived with a smile that could have been sunlight on glass, sharp and bright, but failing to warm anything inside. I stood by the window with the dress folded over my arm and said very little. People found their places in rooms like tide finds shore. They gathered in the center and looked at each other in the way of the socially certain.
The chandelier threw its light down in 1,000 thin knives. There was a hush like a held breath when Zuri moved through the crowd, hand in hand with the man she had chosen. She passed close by me, like someone walking past the window of a stranger. For a moment, I thought she would stop. She did not. When the music took up under the arch, there was a small murmur. The room is a tricky thing. What is meant to be a shelter becomes a stage when people bring their expectations with them. I held the dress in the crook of my arm and felt the air buzz with the weight of all those expectations. I thought of all the times I had made garments for others, coats, shirts, a child's first baptismal frock, and every garment carries a hope stitched inside it, like a coin in a pocket. At some point, a hush rippled like a hand across fabric. People had found the dress where it lay on a chair near the buffet, folded as if in sleep. Zuri saw it then and walked toward it with a speed that made my hands cold. She touched the lace, and for a heartbeat I thought she might pick it up and toss it like a useless thing again. Instead, she looked at the small knot of red thread at the girdle, and her face, my daughter's face, stubborn and young,
and proud, went tender in a way that made the room shift. The next moments were not loud. They were more like the closing of a lid on a box that had been left open. Imani stepped forward first, polished and precise, and opened her mouth to make a remark that would smooth over the awkwardness with the kind of charm that keeps the powerful untroubled. But the charm faltered in her throat. She had not expected to see the red thread. She had not expected the dress to be mended so carefully. I watched her like someone seeing an old photograph with colors rearranged, out of place and yet rendered true. Zuri's hand tightened on the cloth as if she were holding it against some small animal. She turned and looked at me. For a moment, there was an old distance there, the kind that had grown when ambitions rise like a tide between people. Then she did something I did not expect. She put her hand on the dress and slid her fingers along the seam where my red thread hid. "I threw it away," she said, and the sentence hung bare in the chandelier light. It was not a defense, nor a justification. It landed like an item returned to the shelf. The rungs shifted. Some heads tilted with the curiosity of those who watch family matters as if they were a play. Imani's smile had slid off like jewelry. Something in her eyes was raw and small. She moved closer, an unself-consciousness appearing in the way of someone who had been polished down to a hard edge and then found herself scuffed. She reached out and, with a voice that had not been used before, said, "Afia, and stopped. The confession did not come out like the tearing of silk, but like the unbuttoning of a collar. Slow, necessary, and exposing. I had prepared a speech in my head, lines about dignity and respect, about how no person is a possession, about how the hands that stitch are the hands that love. But when Imani truly looked at me, something else rose. It was not revenge. It was the kind of truth that fits into an old coat and keeps it warm. "Why did you do it?" I asked, and my voice was small but steady. Imani's face, which favored the artful mask of society's approval, broke open. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a weight too long, and she let it drop. The words she said were not complete absolution. They were a confession, and in it I heard the small reasons. Her fear of being judged by an image, her desire to keep the shine of her life unmarked. She named a thing she had done without thinking of the consequences for another person's dignity, and in that naming there was the first step toward undoing. Zuri's mouth trembled then. She did not collapse in sorrow, nor fling herself into my arms. She simply reached up and pressed the dress to her chest as if to measure its warmth. "I thought I needed to be new to be enough," she said. The room felt like a held note that was resolving. People let out the space they had been holding. I did not make a grand speech. I had prepared one, but the moment demanded something simpler. I stepped forward and placed my hand, without drama, over Zori's. My thumb found the knot in the red thread, and I pressed gently. "You are enough," I said. The words were not for the crowd, but for the three of us standing in that light, me, my daughter, and the woman who had once thought herself above us. The rest of the room made itself small and polite, like guests at a sensitive funeral. People say forgiveness is like dropping a stone into a lake and watching the circles move outward. For me, it felt more like unpicking a seam and then deciding whether to settle it anew or let the frayed edges remain. I had threaded my red knot as a claim, and in that claim there was an offer that things could be put back with care, not with show. Afterwards, no one made a parade out of the moment. There was no triumph in my chest, only the quiet, rich peace of a stitch that holds. Amani came to me later with a small envelope and a hand that trembled. Inside, there was a note that read simply, "I am sorry. I saw only the shine. I did not see the hands." She left behind a check as well, enough to help open the first month of rent for the Hope Studio. It was not an attempt to erase. It was a practical offering, an admission that sometimes hearts change their shape, and money can help make the room where that change is learned. Zori and I did not fix everything in one day. Reconciliation is not a single needle in the cloth. It is a pattern stitched over time. We sat together in the months that followed and talked in the careful places, over cups of tea, in the quiet of a late afternoon when the city sleeps, at the workbench where she learned to tie a knot skillful enough to hold. She began to come by the studio more often, at first out of obligation, then because she liked the smell of the fabric and the unhurried hum of the machines. Once she asked me to show her how to wind a bobbin, and her fingers fumbled like a child's until they learned to be patient. There were letters, too, small paper things that arrived folded with Kofi's hands still warm in the ink. In one, he had left instructions for the Hope Studio and a small account that he had set aside. The money was enough to take a modest shopfront in a street where the market people moved like a chorus. We painted the window a soft dove gray and nailed up a sign that read Hope Studio in a careful hand. The apprentices came, young men and women who had once sold fruit, washed cars, or ran small errands, bringing their humble tools and a hunger in their eyes for a craft that would restore them to an honest pride. I taught them not just how to cut a pattern, but how to treat a person as if they were the fiber itself, worthy of careful handling, not a blemish to hide. We taught one another to look for a way back into dignity. Nia, small and curious, learned quickly. She would wrap a spool of thread into a circle and set it on the shelf like a crown. I framed the small red thread and hung it on the wall above the teacher's table, a quiet monument to what was saved. There were days when I would sit by the window with the machine off and the sunlight warming the wooden floor, and I would think of all the seams mended beyond fabric. A daughter's shame, a neighbor's arrogance, my own fear of being less than enough. The Hope Studio became a place where these things could be handled with the slow, careful work of needle and hand. People came not for miracles, but for patience, not for spectacle, but for skill. A woman who had once been too proud to enter our street brought her daughter to learn hymns. A man who had forgotten how to respect a tailor's time brought his old suit to be mended and left with a smile that had the shape of new courtesy. When the first framed red thread took its place on the wall, Zuri was standing beside me. She ran a finger along the small circle and then looked up at me with that stubborn light in her eyes. "You sewed me into something that wasn't just a dress," she said. "You sewed me into myself." It was not an easy admission. It was, instead, the slow undoing of armor.
We opened the studio on a weekday morning. People arrived with small bundles, a curtain with a hem pulled loose, a shirt with a button missing, a child's pinafore that had frayed at the collar. The apprentices greeted them, their voices steady. We set to work. The sewing machine hummed like the low voice of the house Kofi and I had built, the sound of living continuing in small, skilled motions. I sat at the teacher's table and watched hands learn the patience that held worlds together. Sometimes at night, when the work was done and the apprentices had gone home, I would take out the dress and smooth it again. It had become more than a garment. It was a ledger of what had been lost and what had been replaced, a quiet map of human frailty and repair. I would press my palm to the place where the red knot rested and a small prayer of thanks, not for grandeur, but for the stubborn, humble fact of mending. There are many kinds of legacies. Kofi's was not a speech or a monument. It was a small account and a belief that a workshop could hold the bones of a community and teach them to be useful to one another. Mine, I learned, was not only in the garments I made, but in the way I would not let my daughter's shame become a final thing. A stitch can be a sentence that changes the course of a life if you let it hold steady. One afternoon, some months after the opening, I found Zuri with Nia at the table. The child had her chin propped in her small hand and was threading a needle with a determination that surprised me. Zuri watched her, and when her eyes met mine, there was a softness I had not known for years. She took the little red spool from where I had lain it on the shelf and handed it to Nia. "Here," she said, "Grandma kept it safe." Nia's small fingers closed around the thread with an instinctive reverence. It was as if the red circle had become a ring passed from one generation to the next, not as a claim of property, but as a covenant to keep working, to keep tending. Sometimes the world insists on spectacle, sometimes it insists on silence. I had chosen to let my answer be neither loud revenge nor meek retreat. I had set a seam in the light where everyone could see how carefully a life can be mended. The dress had been thrown away and taken back and placed where it could be seen, and in that seeing there had come a change that was not sensational but true. When the last apprentice left one evening and the lamps in the studio were turned low, I took the dress down one more time. The red thread lay like a small heart against the pale fabric. I ran my finger across it and felt the ghost of a hand, Kofi's, guiding me as he always had. I folded the gown gently and put it in a cedar chest we kept in the back of the shop, where the smell of wood would keep moths away and memory safe. I do not know what will happen in 20 years. I only know that the machine will keep its steady song here, and that someone will learn to tie a knot so carefully that it will not come undone. I only know the way light looks on a seam when it is done right. It makes the whole cloth seem honest. I sat with the cedar chest closed and thought of the small red thread in the frame above the teacher's bench. It was enough to see the circle of children learning, to hear the low hum of the machines, to know that a place was being made where dignity could be taught the way a stitch is taught, slowly, patiently, humbly. That night I took the dress from the chest and laid it across the table, and for the first time in a long while I did not feel the sting of anything sharp. I threaded the sewing machine once more, set the needle to the right tension, and placed my hands on the fabric. The light over the table was warm. I thought of Kofi's letter, of Amani's apology, of Zuri's hand finding the knot. I thought of the apprentices' faces. I thought of little Naya threading her first needle. "Lord, guide my hands," I whispered, because it was still the truest prayer I knew. I made one last pass along the hem, slow and even. The stitch found its place, and the dress held. I took the finished gown and folded it gently, then sat with my hands in my lap and watched the lamp make a small pool on the workbench. The red thread glowed like a tiny promise on the wall, a reminder that what we keep can become what we give away. I closed my eyes and felt the machine's hum settle into the night like a lullaby. The world outside kept moving, and so did we, stitch by stitch, into whatever came next. Dawn came soft as a sigh that week, the light finding the workshop before the street woke. I opened the shutters and the room filled with a pale, steady wash. The machines sat like sleeping animals, their cords coiled, their metal faces cool. Zuri had already lit the lamp over the teacher's bench and was arranging scraps by color, each pile a small lesson in order and patience. Naya sat on a low stool, legs swinging, watching the thread spool at the edge of the table as if it were a tiny planet. "Good morning, Naya," Zuri said without looking up. She placed a scrap of blue near the red spool. "Today we learn how to make the hem disappear." Naya nodded solemnly and reached for the needle with the deference of someone performing a rite. The needle trembled in her little fingers. I remembered my own first attempts, the way my thumb would catch the eye and the thread would knot like a secret. I moved to the machine and set the tension by feel, an old habit that had become language in my hands. "You take the fabric and you show it mercy," I said to Naya, and she looked up as if I had named a star. "Make the stitch so it keeps the cloth from fraying, but not so tight that it chokes." She did as she was told, and the hem slipped into being. Invisible, honest. Zuri watched, and then, almost without thinking, her shoulders relaxed. There was a small, private smile, one I had seen before when something had been mended in a way that made room again. That morning, someone came to the door who had
not come since the dress was turned into a lesson rather than an accusation. I saw her shadow before I saw her face, a woman carrying a small basket, hands folded over the cloth inside. When she stepped into the light, she cradled the basket like a thing of fragile worth. "Imani," Zuri said. The name broke the room into two sounds, curiosity and caution. Imani set the basket on the bench and looked at all of us, at the machine, at the framed red thread on the wall. She had not been the first to write apology, but she was the first to come with a small, trembling thing in her hands. She met my eyes, and, for a moment, I saw the weight she carried. Not solely shame, but the exhaustion of someone who had kept a secret until keeping it was itself a new burden. "I have come," she said, "because I was told this is where things are learned and made again." Her voice was thin but steady. She had washed her hands, I noticed. They bore no marks of fine work, but there was an eagerness in the way she smoothed the cloth. Zuri set down the spool and opened her palms as if the room were a vessel to hold what came next. "Sit," I said. "Sit and put the basket on the table." Imani obeyed. From inside the basket, she unfurled a small swaddling cloth, plain linen, stitched at the edges with a clumsy, earnest stitch. Tucked in the fold was a letter she had written weeks ago, the one we had read aloud behind the closed door, the one that had begun a long conversation. She did not speak of it now. Instead, she took the basket's lid off and revealed a tiny piece of cloth folded into the shape of a heart. "I cannot undo what was done," she said, voice low, "but I have begun to learn. My sister gave me this scrap. She said if I were to be forgiven, I would have to stitch something that would show that I intended to keep my hands busy for good." She looked at the red thread on the wall and then at the spool on the bench. Her eyes found mine, and in them there was a plea that had nothing theatrical in it, only the human, aching wish to be put where one could be useful. Zuri cleared her throat. "We teach here," she said. "We do not judge with words. We judge with practice." It was not a reprimand. It was the plainest thing I had heard spoken publicly since Kofi's funeral. The measure of a life isn't declared by a single fail, but by what you do after the breaking. Imani bent forward and, with hands that trembled at first, she began to thread a needle under Zuri's guidance. Her fingers were clumsy, and then, slowly, they became less so. Naya watched, wide-eyed, as if watching an alchemist at work. "We set a rule then, so that nothing could be cheapened into spectacle. Imani would learn as any apprentice did. She would mend what was asked of her, she would stay when told to stay, and leave when told to leave. And above all, she would not be expected to perform repentance like a play for the town. If her work was true, the town would see it. If it was not, it would show just as plainly. The first week, she brought bones of cloth from her house, old shirts, a hem on a morning dress, a sleeve with a period of discoloration that had been left as if the fabric itself had been judged. We taught her how to wash with soap and warm water, how to lay the cloth flat on a board and press with a hot iron, how to choose a thread that would give a seam courage. It was slow, mundane work. Her apology, which had been written with sharp ink, softened in the rhythm of towels and starch. Neighbors noticed. Some came with garments for repair, soiled aprons, a child's patched trousers, and Imani, under the watch of Zuri or I, sat at the machine and ran the cloth under the needle. There were mistakes. Once she sewed a cuff on backward and laughed at herself until the sound broke like glass. Once she tied a spool wrong and had to undo 60 stitches. She learned humility and how to undo and redo, which is a lesson the world seldom values. In the meantime, life spun on. The apprentices grew steadier. New faces drifted in. A man whose wife had left, who wanted a new shirt. An elderly woman who wanted to undo 20 years of tight seams in a blouse that had become a prison. A young man who wanted suit alterations for a job he hoped would last. Each person carried a story like a stitch, a small thread that had a larger cloth attached. We listened as much as we mended. It is easy to hide behind busyness, but the hum of machines made space for speech. Soft confessions over the hiss of steam, jokes flung like pins that stuck and made people grin. There were moments that tested the patience of the shop. One afternoon, a boy named Kele came in with a torn shirt. He had less than a coin to spare and more pride than sense. He argued about price, raised his voice, and in the heat of the moment, Imani, new to the place, answered with sharpness. For a heartbeat, the room remembered the old days, the hard edges of small-town scorn. Then Zuri, quietly and without a raised finger, told them both to sit and take their tea. "You will speak like that at the market and be given the market's answer," she said. "We speak differently here." Kele drank his tea, and when he left not only with his shirt mended, but with a small piece of cloth Imani had wrapped around the buttons, a ribbon of red woven into it at Zuri's suggestion. The ribbon was not decoration so much as a marker. Here, someone had touched wrong and had been touched by repair. Kele walked away with his shoulders a little less straight with defiance and a little more in the pose of someone who might yet learn to ask. That evening, I found myself at the teacher's bench with my hands moving as if driven by habit rather than thought. The deed of making had become its own prayer again. The red thread in the frame watched me like a small son. I stitched the hem of a coat for an old man who had come in asking only for warmth. He told me, between the snipping of threads, a story about his brother in the fields, about a harvest that failed, and the neighbor who lent a hand. His voice was small, but full of the kind of truth the shop liked, simple, factual, human. "Keep it by the fire," I told him when I handed back the coat. "It will keep you warmer if you remember to keep it out of the rain." He laughed in the way people do when they are given something practical instead of platitude. As he left, he clasped my hand with a strength that surprised me. I felt in that clasp the pulse of the town, grace measured not in speeches, but in acts that make life possible. Spring brought a naming. There is always more than one way to use a saved garment, and this time the dress, no longer the object of shame, but a study in mending, was asked to sit on a chair during the ceremony for a child whose mother had come to our shop weeks before for a hem. The mother, a soft-spoken woman named Amara, wanted the dress displayed as a thing that had been healed, as a lesson to the child that life would hand down mistakes and mendings alike. We dressed the chair, placed the gown neatly folded upon it with the red knot visible, and when the elders spoke,
They used words that did not name the past wrongs precisely, but which called the gathering to see how a thing once broken could be made whole in a new way. The child, little Masego, sat on his mother's knee and poked the red thread with a pudgy finger. The knot looked like a painted berry in his small palm. After the ceremony, people stayed and talked. Someone offered to bring food to the apprentices. Someone else offered a small loan of bolts of cloth left over from a wedding. The town's rhythms, which had been stepped around the dress like a hot coal for a while, began to step nearer, with curiosity and with the tentative courage of those who have been taught to look more closely. Imani kept attending. She took to making a small cloth pouch for people who came in.
Nervous about asking for repair, she sewed their name into the lining if it was a gift, or if the garment belonged to someone who had died, she mended it with the gentleness of someone learning to hold memory sacred. Once, at dusk, she came to me and said, "I want to learn to make a seam that can be shown to others as proof that I am different." "Then make a seam that endures," I told her. "Make something you would give to your sister. If it can bear the light, then it will bear everything else." She did. Her stitches grew steadier. The thread tension evened like the note of a voice finding its key. One morning, she brought in a blanket she had mended with the red thread. It was not flashy. The red ran like a quiet river along one seam, and on the back she had sewn a small circle, 2 fingers wide, of gathered cloth, where she had knotted the end with hands that trembled and then did not. When she placed it on the bench and looked at me, there were tears she would not make spectacle of. "It's for my niece," she said. "I want her to know that when I took a thing and made it better, I did not do it for praise. I did it because I learned how to hold." We put that blanket into the cedar chest with the dress. There came a moment when the chest no longer smelled only of wood and cedar, but of the quiet history of mending, the small, honest sense of linen, starch, and the oil from well-used hands. The chest had become a kind of ledger of the town's private reconciliations, a place where cloth and intention were recorded together. Not everything that came through our door bent toward goodness. There were days when spite threaded itself through a seam. An old rival of mine, a woman named Maida, who had once run a millinery stall, came to the shop because her hat had been crushed in a rain. She watched our work with a critical, almost professional disdain. When she learned that we had accepted Imani, she regarded us as if we had taken in a breach of manners. "You'll be ruined by charity," Maida told me once, leaning on my counter like a judge. "Traffic will go past your door and see nothing but the poor." "Traffic will go past and see people learning to keep what matters," I answered. "There is room for both, work and mercy." She snorted and left. A week later, she sent a hat to be mended, and when she came back to collect it, she was quieter and her words were softer. She paid in coin and in a small homemade ribbon she could not wear herself. She had made it with care, and I recognized that a person who stitches is a person who learns patience, whether she likes it or not. There were other gifts. A carpenter donated a second bench. Small satchels arrived with needles and scissors from a woman who lived 2 towns away and remembered the kindness of a seam done by a neighbor in her youth. We became a place where other people's memory of repair came to rest and renew itself. On the night the Harvest Festival came, the workshop stayed open late. The apprentices asked to keep watch, a chance perhaps to see the town in its best light. Bunting was strung outside, and the hum of the machines inside the shop was a steady heartbeat beneath the laughter from the square. We draped some of the mended garments on a line by the window. The coat with the red ribbon at the cuff, the child's patched trousers, the blanket with the circle on the back, and passers-by peered through and smiled. A few stopped and told us a story of a stitch their grandmother had taught them, or of a shirt that had came through a war and still bore the signs of life. As the night deepened, someone began to sing in the square. It was a simple song with a chorus that everyone knew. The sound drifted through the open windows and laid itself over the machines and bolts of cloth. I folded my hands in my lap and listened,
and the song made the shop feel like a body breathing, whole if not perfect. After the singing had faded, Imani stayed behind with me and Zuri. She looked around at the room we had made and seemed small and large at once. "I do not know if I will ever be forgiven by everyone," she said, "but I know how to mend a sleeve, and I know how to press a collar. I do not suppose that those things will be enough to erase what I did, but perhaps the habit of doing them will change what I want to do next time." Zuri nodded, and in that nod there was a kind of benediction. "That is the only way we have," she said. "A life is a set of hands and what they learn to do." I sat with them both until the lamps were nearly out. I thought of Kofi again, of his insistence that a place could be made to hold people and their failures, and I marveled at the stubbornness of that belief. It had been a small rebellion, to insist that craft and care could be a way of teaching dignity. To keep doing that is to gamble on the hopeful sturdiness of human beings. Days folded into months. The apprentices learned not only to stitch, but to be present for one another. When Nia was ill with a fever, Zuri and Imani took turns sitting by the bedside with a bowl of cool water and patched her clothes so her mother would have one less thing to worry about. When a young man returned from the city with news that his mother had died, we mended a shroud because the family had no money for proper work. It was slow work, and it did not make us famous, but it altered the texture of the town little by little. One winter afternoon, when snow lay thin and determined on the roofs, a letter arrived with Kofi's handwriting traced across the envelope like a map. It was not for me, but for the shop. His nephew had sent it from a place beyond the river. I opened it at the bench and read, voice barely above the whisper of the needles. "Kofi's nephew writes," Zuri said when I reached a natural pause. "He says he is coming to see the place his uncle loved." We set a place at the bench for him. When he arrived, he was young, in a way that belied the distance he had come. His eyes were like a man who had found both defeat and courage on the road. He brought with him a small tin box of metal buttons. Kofi's boxes had been legendary, and a photograph in which Kofi stood with a sewing machine between his hands and a laugh in his eyes. He wanted this place to be kept, the nephew said. He said that if a town would not build a school, you could at least make a school of keeping. We gave him tea and a chair and a spool of the red thread. He opened the box and set the buttons upon the table like tiny coins. He watched us with a careful curiosity, and then, as if the place had achieved some unspoken right, he asked if he might learn. He had never sewn, he said. He had been a carpenter and a wanderer and a man who had not thought his hands had a language that could be learned. We put a needle into his fingers and showed him how to thread. His first stitches were stiff, but there was an openness about him that made it easy to teach. When he learned to do a neat backstitch, we applauded as if he had found a new country. It surprised him. He had not expected applause for such a small thing. The nephew stayed a while. He helped us repair a torn banner for the square, and at night would sit by the window with the photograph of Kofi and tell us stories we had not known. In his words, Kofi was never a saint. He was a man who liked to make small jokes and who cursed softly when a needle bent or a spool tangled. He was human. The photograph showed a face that had done this work with joy and a sort of stubborn commitment. It was no small thing to find that someone else had kept the flame lit. By the time spring returned again, the red thread had taken a life like ivy. It wound across hems and into linings and became a quiet signature. More than a mark of shame. Children began to ask about it the way they asked about the sun or about rain. Some wanted to see where threads came from. Some insisted on wearing a ribbon with a small red stitch braided into their hair. It became a kind of covenant, not between guilt and absolution, but between hand and habit, a reminder that the making of things could teach how to keep one another. One morning, as I sorted through the cedar chest, I found the old dress folded as I had left it, the red knot visible like a heartbeat. I smoothed it and thought of all the hands it had passed through and the hands it had taught. I lifted the dress to the lamp and watched the light travel along the seams I had stitched.
In the glass of the window, the town moved as it always had, slow, stubborn, ordinary. Inside, the shop hummed. I set the dress aside and stood. The apprentices were there, busy with their own work, a hem here, a cuff there. Zuri called to Nia to show her how to mark fabric without leaving a bruise. Imani laughed at a joke someone made about a needle that had a mind of its own. The nephew wound the red thread onto a new spool, his fingers learning the rhythm as if it were a prayer. I threaded my own needle and, with deliberate care, made a long, even stitch down the length of a new apron for the shop. As I worked, I felt the history of those who had taught me, Kofi's steady instruction, my mother's impatient hands, the memory of quiet women pressing collars by firelight. A seam is a conversation across time. When you hold it right, you can hear the voices. When the stitch finished, I cut the thread and tied the knot small and resolute. I pushed the needle into a pincushion and looked up at the framed red thread on the wall. It seemed to glow differently now, not as a relic, but as a lamp. I thought of the children who would grow up in this town, learning that hands could make whole what the world had torn. And I felt not triumph, but a quiet, steady contentment. Outside, someone knocked on the door, a man with a parcel wrapped in plain cloth. He set it on the step and, without waiting for an answer, moved on. Zuri stood and went to fetch it, and the three of us watched as she unwrapped a coat, heavy with mud but whole at its seams. The coat had been mended elsewhere long ago and brought to us now for finishing. "Who sent it?" I asked. Zuri smiled and shook her head. "No one who will stay," she said. "Sometimes help is a passing thing. Sometimes a seam is a message that someone cared enough to send." We set to work together, each of us touching the fabric in a different way. My hands found the place where the lining needed reinforcement. Imani stitched a small patch at the inside pocket where a boy had once kept a coin, perhaps his last. The nephew sewed a button with a quiet reverence that would have made Kofi smirk. When the coat was done, we folded it and wrapped it in a clean cloth. Someone would collect it. Someone would wear it. The world is full of people knitting short kindnesses into the lives of others. Small things, repeated, make the pattern. I stood for a while at the workbench after the others had gone home. The lamp made a pool of light on the board, and the machines hummed their familiar lullaby. The cedar chest smelled faintly of the sea of lives it contained: cloth, smoke, starch, oil. I placed my hands on the bench and, with no grand speech, I said a thank you into the quiet. For the people who had come, for the hands that had learned, for Kofi's stubborn faith in a workshop. The work would continue. There would be more apologies, more mistakes, more stitches that frayed and had to be redone. There would be days of cold and days of heat, of people turning away and of people turning toward. But for now, the shop was a room full of sound and light and the soft, holy industry of mending. I turned off the lamp, left the door unlatched, and walked home with the image of the red knot at the center of my thought. Small, bright, and enough.